Chapter 1 Reincarnation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Within the city of New York, near the University of Columbia, sat a young man of Italian-American descent in his mid-20s. This man's name was Frank Caruso, who was sitting at his desk staring towards his computer screen as he played a competitive match of a popular strategy game based on classical antiquity. He quickly executed his commands as he played as the Romans against another player who utilized the armies of Hannibal against him. With the click of a button, his troops swiftly marched in formation against the other player. Before long, the legions of Rome clashed with the sacred band of Carthage. Unbeknownst to his rival, Frank had set his auxilia forces to encircle the Carthaginians in a classic double-dot envelopment. On this virtual battlefield, tens of thousands of computer-generated soldiers shed each other's blood as a familiar scene displayed itself. Inspired by the Carthaginian general Hannibal, Frank expertly transitioned his forces into a double envelopment, which was the same tactic Carthage had famously used against the Romans at Cannae, resulting in one of the worst military defeats the Roman Republic had ever suffered. Before long, the other player's soldiers were trapped in a square surrounded by the Romans, stabbing away at the Carthaginians' virtual flesh with their gladii. Eventually, the overwhelming victory display appeared on Frank's screen, where the screeching of the other player could be read behind an anonymous wall of text. "Kill yourself, loser. You must be some kind of virgin net. I hope you die a miserable death." By now, Frank was too mature to take the bait and get upset over such childish taunts. Instead, he replied with a snarky comment of his own. "Get good." After leaving this disparaging message, Frank shut off his game and reached over to grab his coat. As he did so, he knocked over a few textbooks on his desk related to his schoolwork. In particular, they revolved around the final days of the Western Roman Empire and what was commonly referred to as the Dark Ages. Having completed his undergrad, Frank was now working on his PhD in history. Though he knew quite a lot about all eras of European history, he had always been drawn to the ancient Romans, especially the final days of their once-mighty empire. However, he had no such concerns at the moment, for there was a far more critical task to be had, and that was going to the store to pick up an energy drink. These books weren't going to read themselves, and it was already well past midnight. If he were to get his schoolwork done in time for the following day, he would need to pull another all-nighter. By now, that was something he was well accustomed to. As such, he draped his coat over his shoulders and walked out of his apartment into the cold winter's night. Frank made sure to lock his door behind him before treading across the snowy streets of New York. After a short while, he reached the nearest gas station, where he noticed an impoverished vagrant leaning against the exterior of the little building. The man had a bottle of whiskey in his hand and was clearly intoxicated. Thinking nothing of it, Frank pressed forward into the shop where he selected his favorite brand and flavor of energy drink, as well as a bag of chips. He commonly referred to these items as gamer fuel. The young man approached the cash register with his goods, where the clerk placed them inside a small bag after ringing him up. Having paid for the food, Frank exited the building, where he noticed the vagrant was no longer loitering. He merely shrugged his shoulders before returning to his apartment upon seeing this. However, as he approached the edge of the parking lot, he noticed the vagrant bump into him. However, this was no accident. As soon as Frank turned around to apologize to the man, he saw that the vagrant was holding onto a knife, which he quickly pressed against Frank's throat. Frank immediately dropped his belongings and raised his hands in panic, signaling that he was not a threat as he began to speak to the man who was mugging him with a cautious tone in his frightened voice. "Take whatever you want. I don't have much, but it is yours." As soon as Frank said this, the vagrant began to search his body, looking for his wallet. As he did so, the blade slipped by and cut through one of the arteries in Frank's neck. Blood began to gush out of his neck like a fountain as he stared at the sanguine-coated blade in disbelief before collapsing to the floor in a pool of his own blood. The vagrant began to panic, seeing how he accidentally cut the young man's throat, and swiftly picked up the bags left behind by his victim before running off, leaving Frank alone, bleeding out in the snowy street, as this occurred, a single thought passed through his mind. Is this really how it ends? Before long, utter darkness prevailed, leaving Frank well and truly dead. Titus Claudius Marcellus shook with a start as his mind regained clarity. He did not know why, but after a severe impact to his skull from the club of a Suebi warrior, he had a flash of inspiration, or quite possibly a vision from the gods about an alien world far more advanced than anything he had ever seen before. In this alien world, he was a student of history by a different name who had attended a prestigious institution of higher learning. However, he had met an untimely demise at the hands of a common criminal within the streets of a vibrant metropolis. Be nov com, he could hardly believe that his battered mind had conjured such a strange vision. Had he entered the realm of the gods, or had he seen a glimpse of the future? Whatever had occurred, it was indeed a sight to behold. However, now was not the time to dwell on such concerns. Instead, he was faced with a potentially lethal situation as he lay on the ground with a barbarian warrior bringing his weapon down upon him in an attempt to finish the job. Marcellus grasped hold of his spada, which lay by his side before rolling out of the way of the oncoming club. As he did so, he could hear the primitive weapon thud against the ground, yet he paid no attention to this. Instead, he stood up from the grass beneath his feet and readjusted his gilded iron helmet as he prepared to engage in mortal combat. The pale Germanic warrior noticed that his prey had escaped his grasp and turned around with a wicked grin on his face, shouting something in a language that Marcellus did not understand before charging at him like a wild boar. Marcellus raised his oval-shaped scutum in defense as the club clanged against it before pushing the man aside with his shield and thrusting his spada through the barbarian's riveted mail armor. As the cold steel pierced through his gut, blood poured from the long-haired barbarian's mouth while he forced his torso through the length of the blade in an attempt to get in reach of Marcellus' skull. However, as the inches of Noric steel pierced even further through the barbarian's torso, the man soon found the strength leaving his body before falling to his knees. Marcellus quickly withdrew his sword and raised it in the air for a decapitating blow. Before launching the final stroke of his blade, he cursed the man who had so thoroughly ringed his bell before taking his life. Filthy barbarian! After saying this, he unleashed his spada onto the man's neck, severing his head in the process. After withdrawing his sword, Marcellus shouted to the troops under his command as he attempted to rally them in the thick of battle. Reform the line. Hold strong. Upon hearing their general's command, the nearby soldiers of the Roman army regrouped and entered the formation, pressing their thick scutums together as they held the line against the rampaging Suebi warriors. With every clash against their shields, the Roman soldiers moved in sync like a well-oiled machine as they pushed the enemy aside and thrust their blades into the enemy's bodies. Seeing how these men were Suebi, few of them had any form of body armor, and those who did were generally considered veteran warriors of the highest caliber. Before long, the Romans began to push back the wave of barbarians as they cut the enemy into ribbons. As the tides of war shifted, the Suebi began to rout. However, as they did so, the Roman cavalry appeared from within the forest and chased them down, spearing the barbarian warriors in the back as they attempted to flee the field of battle. For the Suebi, there would be no mercy on this day. As the battle came to an end, Marcellus wiped the blood which coated his blade onto the wool tunic of a nearby slain barbarian before sheathing it within its brown leather scabbard, which was attached to a baldric across his torso. Blood was splattered across his bronze scale armor, and even his handsome face was marred with the gore of his enemies. Marcellus took off his dented gilded iron helmet whose red plume was arrogantly displayed upon its crest, revealing his brown hair as he gazed with his olive-green eyes upon one of his commanders who rushed towards his position with an ecstatic expression on his face. General! We have achieved a great victory against the Suebi here today. If the Supreme Commander were here, he would surely reward you for your efforts. Marcellus merely chuckled as he placed his blood-stained hand upon the commander's shoulder before expressing his thoughts on the matter. Just another day in service to the Empire, my friend. Titus Claudius Marcellus came from a renowned family and held the position of general in the Western Roman army. At the moment, he was serving under the supreme commander of the Western Roman army, Flavius Stilicho. Though he was only in his mid-20s, he had proven himself as a capable military leader from a young age, especially during the previous Gothic invasion. During these desperate times, he had risen to his current status after a string of overwhelming victories against the Empire's many enemies. However, one could also claim that his rapid ascent through the ranks was in no small part due to his close relationship with the Supreme Commander. Currently, Marcellus and his army were campaigning in Gaul as they attempted to end the reign of the usurper Flavius Claudius Constantinus and drive back the rampaging Germanic tribes who had recently crossed over the Rhine. This was the first significant battle they encountered after entering the chaotic province. As the Roman soldiers began to clean up the battlefield and bury their dead, many of the men started to kneel in the direction of Rome and pray. When the commander saw that Marcellus remained standing, he questioned his actions. "Do you not intend to give thanks to the Lord God Almighty for this victory? Without him, none of this could have been achieved." There was a hint of disdain in Marcellus' eyes as he gazed upon the commander before shaking his head while responding to the question. "No, Lucan, I do not believe I will. I have other matters to attend to, but you have my permission to pray in my stead." The commander, known as Lucan, smiled, and nodded before breaking out into prayer. As for Marcellus, he walked away from the scene, not wanting to have any part in the Christian rites. Instead, he reached underneath his larica squamata vest and pulled out a small pendant in the form of a gold coin that hung around his neck. This coin contained the visage of Sol Invictus, one of the old gods of Rome. The moment he was out of sight, he began to pray to the god of his ancestors, thanking him for the great victory that Rome had achieved on this day. For if he had done so in public, he was sure to be persecuted by the Christians who now dominated the empire. As Marcellus finished his prayer, he gazed into the setting sun, wondering what the vision he had seen in his rattled state could have possibly meant. Perhaps it was an omen for what was to come. Regardless, he chose not to dwell on such a foreboding subject any longer. Whatever may come to pass, he would meet it with steel in his hand, and the troops beneath his command, for the glory of Rome was eternal. Chapter 2 No time for celebration. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After the battlefield was cleaned up, the Romans had returned to their posts at the temporary encampment that they had established while on campaign, which lay on the border of the diocese of Gaul. Though the men beneath Marcellus' command wanted to celebrate their great victory over the Suebi, their first duty was to protect the empire's borders as men in the Roman military. Thus, there was no grand celebration on this night. Marcellus stood within his command tent, gazing upon a map sprawled across his table, which was illuminated via candlelight. While he was studying the reports from the scouts within his army, the shadowy figure of a busty woman appeared behind him. Without warning, the young general felt the warmth of a woman's dainty hands wrap around his shoulders and the softness of her chest press against his back. Rather than turn around and entertain the buxom beauty who had latched herself onto him, Marcellus merely replied with a stern tone after drinking from his chalice. "Not now, Siegfrieda." The woman instantly began to pout as she turned around and sat on her master's bed. Upon hearing the displeased sound escape from her lips, Marcellus turned around and stared into the eyes of the beautiful woman sitting before him. She wore a collar around the neck, signifying her status as a lowly slave. Yet, despite this position, Marcellus placed down his drink and sighed as he apologized to her. "I'm sorry, I'm just having a hard time thinking straight." A look of worry spread across the gorgeous slave's face as she walked over to Marcellus and checked on his condition. "You are not wounded, are you? I swear to the gods if one of those Suebi bastards hurt you, I will wipe out their entire tribe." Marcellus laughed as he heard this ludicrous statement. He quickly grabbed hold of Siegfrieda's chin as he attempted to kiss her on the lips. However, she immediately tilted her head, resulting in a peck on the cheeks. Seeing that his efforts were thwarted, Marcellus immediately scratched the back of his head and dispersed the woman's worries by under-exaggerating the extent of his injuries. "I'm fine, I just got hit on the head a little, it is nothing serious." The slave began to blush as she pushed herself away from Marcellus' embrace. Though she would love nothing more than to be intimate with her master, there were good reasons that she was forced to reject his advances. Sigefrida knew that if she were to have any other master, she would be severely punished for such actions. Nevertheless, Marcellus allowed it and merely drank from his chalice once more as the woman chastised him for his lifestyle. Seriously, Marcellus, after all of these years, and you are still looking for comfort in my arms. Why don't you get yourself a wife already? Despite the casual tone used by the woman, the Roman general merely laughed at her comment before finishing the rest of his wine. After doing so, he placed the container on the nightstand next to the flagon, where Sigefrida was quick to refill his cup. As she did so, he responded with the same line he used every time she asked this question. You know me, Sigefrida. I am married to Rome. The slave woman immediately rolled her eyes as she heard this comment for the 9 millionth time this year and began to preach the qualities that made so many young women chase after her master. I am just saying that you are wealthy, you hold the prestigious title of general at your young age, you are descended from one of the most prominent patrician families in the empire, and you are dangerously handsome. What Roman woman wouldn't want you as their husband? Marcellus refused to discuss this topic further and raised his hand in the air, hinting for the woman to be silent. I appreciate your concern, but I am fine the way I am. Noticing that she had overstepped her bounds, Sigefrida immediately ceased pouring the wine and walked up to Marcellus, where she began to comfort him by stroking his olive-brown hair. As she did so, she started to speak in a tone like that of a mother or a concerned older sister. I am just worried about your future, that is all. When you aren't on a brutal campaign, you live alone in your villa with only me and a handful of other slaves to keep you company. What would your mother say if she knew how you spent your days? Marcellus grabbed a hold of Sigefrida's hand and looked deep into her ice-blue eyes with a kind-hearted glance. Sigefrida was a Swabi by birth, and as such, her features were Germanic in nature. She was tall, with an hourglass figure and ivory skin that had a slight pinkish pigment. Accompanying her excellent physique was long platinum blonde hair that was currently tied up into a ponytail. You are all I need. Sigefrida immediately glanced away as she heard these words and began to reflect upon her past. She had come from a Swabi family, and was taken captive along with her mother by Romans after her father, and the other warriors of his war-band were defeated in battle. Ever since she was sold into slavery to Marcellus' family as a young child, it had been her job to look after the boy. Despite her feelings, Marcellus' mother had strictly warned her not to get involved with him romantically. Even though they were now adults, and she was exclusively his slave, the fear within her heart towards that woman kept her emotionally at arm's length. Upon seeing Sigefrida's reaction, Marcellus sighed before picking up the chalice of wine that she had refilled and began to chug its contents. After a few moments, he turned away from her and walked towards the door. As he did so, the woman began to call out after him with a hint of worry in her tone. Where are you going at this hour? Marcellus, slightly annoyed with yet another one of Sigefrida's rejections, shouted back a quick retort before exiting the flaps of the large tent. To keep watch. After Marcellus had left Sigefrida alone in his quarters, she sighed heavily and toyed with the iron collar around her neck. A single thought passed through her mind as she lamented her position in life. If only I were born a Roman. As for Marcellus, he marched through the temporary encampment for some time before arriving at its palisade. He proceeded to climb up the watchtower, where he gazed out towards the direction of the lands occupied by the usurper known commonly by the name Constantine III with a stern expression on his face. As he stared off into the distance, a familiar voice called out to him. It belonged to none other than the commander who bore the name Sextus Cornelius Lucan. I see you are standing watch yet again. A man of your position should not trouble himself with such petty matters. Marcellus remained silent as he gazed at the high-ranking officer, who was older than him by close to 2 decades. Lucan had been in the service of Rome for nearly 30 years and had proven himself repeatedly in battle. If it were not for Marcellus' close ties to Flavius Stilicho, then this man would likely be the one in his position. Despite this blatant nepotism, Lucan did not seem to mind that he was second in command of the field army. After all, Since its inception, Rome had always shown favoritism to those with close friends in high places, and Marcellus had won the lottery with his birth. Not only was the young general the son of one of the most prominent patrician families, but the supreme commander was his godfather, allowing him to rise through the ranks of the military rapidly. A man in Lucan's position had to accept the cards he was dealt in life. As such, there was no resentment in his heart towards Marcellus. The young general sighed as he returned his attention to the camp's proximity before expressing the thoughts on his mind. The scouts report a great power rising in the east. They say this force is responsible for driving the Germans into our lands. They show no mercy as they butcher every man and animal they come across while enslaving the women and children. God only knows what horrors they inflict upon their captives. Is it just me, Lucan, or does it appear that the world is coming to its end? Lucan sighed heavily and answered his general's question with a stoic expression on his aging face. I believe every generation gazes upon the madness of the world and expects it to all come crashing down around them. However, our ancestors have fought bravely to maintain Rome in all its glory, and now that task falls to us. For if we falter here, then it will truly be the end of the world as we know it. Have faith, my friend, if not in God, then in the loyalty and strength of your brothers in arms. After speaking of his philosophy to Marcellus, the officer known by the name Lucan turned away and climbed down the ladder of the watchtower. As he slowly descended, he left one final piece of advice to the young general. Marcellus, I suggest you get some sleep. We have a long campaign ahead of us, and the last thing we need is for you to be exhausted. Marcellus silently nodded his head in response. He would continue to watch over the border for another 30 minutes before heading back to his tent, where he immediately stripped off his gear and climbed into bed with Sigefrida. Chapter 3 Preparing for an Invasion. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As the light of dawn shone itself upon the Roman encampment, Marcellus awoke from his slumber. Lying next to him was his slave, Sigefrida. He had taken great liberties as a general to ensure that Sigefrida was in the safety of the military camp instead of on the perimeter within the followers' base. One might even say he had outright broken the law by doing so. Regardless, he did not care. Rome was in a state of peril, and thus Marcellus could bend the rules if he so desired. After rising from his bed, Sigefrida awoke beside him, gazing at his bareback as he leaned off the edge of the cot. The Swaby woman crawled out from under her covers, completely naked, and immediately rose from her slumbering position as she prepared to dress her master for his upcoming duties. Her bountiful breasts swayed as she began equipping Marcellus with his attire. The young general struggled to avert his gaze from the woman's sublime figure but ultimately failed to do so. He continued to stare in awe at his beautiful slave as he did every morning, suppressing his desire to take her then and there. Only after he was fully clothed and armored did Sigefrida begin to dress in her ragged attire. Though Marcellus desired to buy her nice clothing from the East, the wise woman had refused time and again. After all, she was a slave, and to wear such luxuries in her position was to invoke the ire of the people who lived above her low status. Marcellus ultimately broke the silence that pervaded between them as he began to exit the tent. Today, we will be advancing further into the usurper's territory. Armed conflict is bound to occur, so stay safe. Upon hearing this warning, Sigefrida nodded her head as a warm smile spread across her luscious lips before responding to her master's concerns. You can rest easy, I know how to take care of myself. Such a response invoked a sense of calmness inside of Marcellus' heart. This was not the first campaign he had dragged this woman on, and it certainly wouldn't be her last. By now, she was well accustomed to protecting herself from friend and foe alike. After looking upon Sigefrida's exceptional beauty one last time, Marcellus exited out of his tent and into the temporary encampment that had been established near the borders of Gaul. After departing from his quarters, Marcellus ventured forth through the camp with an arrogant stride. Everywhere he stepped, his soldiers stood up and saluted him with respect and fear for the position he held. Eventually, the young general came across a man he held significant disdain for. This man was sharpening his blade on a grinding wheel. He was a Gothic chieftain by the name of Sarus, and he was the commander of the federati attached to Marcellus' army. The moment the two made eye contact with one another, the atmosphere that surrounded them became tense. They had a long history together. The two of them had served alongside one another during the invasion of Italy by the Gothic chieftain Radagaisus 2 years prior. During that conflict, Marcellus had earned a fearsome reputation as a slayer of Goths, putting any man, woman, and child he came across who belonged to that tribe to the sword. If Sarus were not aligned with Rome as a member of its federati, he too would have suffered such a brutal fate. The memories of Marcellus' cruelty as he ordered the massacre of entire populations of the Gothic people had forged an intense sense of dread within Sarus's heart towards his general. It was for this reason that though he obeyed Marcellus' orders, he did not treat him with the respect a man of his position was afforded. Sarus sneered in disdain as he gazed upon Marcellus' handsome visage before speaking to him with a tone of contempt. The sarcastic use of the Roman victory title did not go unnoticed by the young general. "Gothicus, surely you are not thinking of spilling my blood here and now, within your camp." The title of Gothicus was usually given to Roman generals who had achieved significant victories against the Goths. Yet, despite his achievements in the past 2 Gothic wars, Marcellus had not earned such an impressive title. As such, when Sarus referred to Marcellus in this manner, it was an insult to the man's pride, as it reminded the young general of the glories that Emperor Honorius had denied him. Marcellus looked upon the commander of his federati with utter disgust. He would not deign such an insult to his pride with a response. Instead, he merely turned his gaze away from the barbarian chieftain and followed his path towards the center of the encampment. Sarus, on the other hand, gazed upon Marcellus back with a hint of scorn in his eyes before shifting his attention onto the young general's tent. He knew that there was a swaby beauty hidden away inside and swore the moment that Marcellus met his death, he would take her as his prize. However, for now he would wait. After all, though he did not show the general respect, he greatly feared the man. In the eyes of the Gothic chieftain, few men were as cold-hearted and ruthless as Marcellus was. As such, he disregarded his wicked thoughts and got back to work sharpening his blade. Eventually, Marcellus reached the center of the encampment where a command tent was located. He quickly entered the structure and saw Lucan and the other commanders under his command gathered together as they studied a map. This map showed the known positions of the usurper's forces and that of the barbarian invaders. Lucan immediately stood up and saluted his general as Marcellus entered the tent, as did the other officers beside them. The young general returned their salute as he shifted his attention to the map sprawled across the table. "Have we received word from our scouts?" Lucan smiled and nodded as he quickly repeated the information he had received not long ago. "Our scouts have reported a sizable force of the usurper's army stationed within the city of Valence. It is led by one of his federati commanders by the name of Nebiogastes, who is a Frankish chieftain. If we can lay siege to the city, we might be able to trap the enemy commander within its walls and eliminate a large portion of the usurper's army." Marcellus gazed upon the wooden figures that represented the various forces that lay within the borders of Gaul and their current estimated locations. Upon seeing the Frankish federati in their position, he decided on a course of action. "Our armies will surround the city and lay siege to it, where we will annihilate the enemy within. Whether they be Roman or barbarian, any man who pledges his loyalty to the usurper Constantine will have his head removed." The various officers beneath Marcellus' command immediately nodded in agreement as they made the necessary plans for such an assault. After a while, Lucan broke the silence by bringing up the subject that none of them wished to discuss. "And what if the federati beneath our command betray us? They make up 2/3 of our forces. If they side with the enemy, we will be vastly outnumbered, with no chances of survival." As Romans, the men within this room were all too aware of the frailty of the alliance between Rome and its barbarian mercenaries. Every time they marched to war, they had to fear the potential reality of their allies turning on them amid battle. Yet Marcellus remained undeterred as he scoffed at the reaction of his top officers. "You think Sarus will betray us? He may be a filthy barbarian and a two-faced scoundrel, but he knows the price he would pay should he betray me. Even if it were the last thing that I accomplish in this life, I would find a way to take him with me to the grave." Lucan nodded his head. He could not deny that Marcellus had gained a fearsome reputation as a slayer of barbarians. As such, he disregarded his previous concerns and asked the following question on his mind. "When do we set out?" Marcellus had no hesitation. He knew the sooner they marched on to Valence, the more likely it was that their plan would succeed. As such, he boldly declared his orders for all his commanders to receive and enact as an extension of his will. "We march at noon. I want to be in the vicinity of the city within a week." Upon hearing this, the gathered officers quickly saluted their general and affirmed their orders. "Yes, sir." Before long, the Roman encampment was torn down, and the army was on the march once more. The enemies of Rome would soon be facing an army at their gates. As for whether the Foederati would indeed betray their Roman counterparts, only time would tell. Chapter 4 Enemy Ambush. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the forests of Gaul, a Roman army was on the march. Surrounded by their Gothic Foederati allies, the army under Marcellus's command made its way ever closer to the city of Valence, where the enemy commander Nebuchadnezzar lies in wait with his barbarian horde. Scouts advanced beyond the main army as the young general sat upon horseback while trotting forth through the Gallic territory with a beautiful woman latched to his back. Though Siegfried should typically be traveling in the rear of the formation with the rest of the followers, Marcellus had ensured that she was not forced to march across the vast distance between their previous encampment and the location of their enemies. Instead, he had her ride in a position behind him upon his mount, much to the ire of the Romans and Foederati alike. Such an action was not only against the regulations of the Roman army but also heavily disfavored by the soldiers beneath Marcellus' command. Despite this, he did not care in the slightest, as he felt the safest place for the woman he loved was by his side in the center of the formation. After all, they were marching deep into enemy territory and could be ambushed at a moment's notice. However, despite the kind gesture by the young general, his slave was not happy. She was forced to endure the angry stares of thousands of men as she clung tightly to her master. Such a thing was enough to make even one with the most stalwart of hearts falter under pressure. Because of this, she kept her face pressed against Marcellus' back, unwilling to look around. Though Marcellus did not mind such a thing, after all, he enjoyed the warmth she provided him, even if he was equipped with a thick bronze larica squamata around his torso. He pressed his hands around her own as he whispered in a voice so low that only the two of them could hear it. "I am sorry for making you put up with such a thing, but you know how I worry about you. If we were to be ambushed and something happened to you, I would never be able to forgive myself." Behind closed eyelids, Siegfried's ice-blue irises twitched as a rosy tone flushed over her ivory cheeks. Every time her master spoke sweet nothings in her ears, she felt her heart race in excitement, only for it to come crashing down into a complete state of depression. As a lowly Suebi slave, she could never be with her master, not so long as she wore this collar around her neck, nor until that woman drew her final breath. Even if she were to somehow be with her master intimately, she would never be able to become his lawful wife nor carry his legitimate child. Such thoughts caused the gorgeous woman to feel as if her heart had been wrapped in a cage of thorns, the slightest beat driving her organ to be pricked by the sharp edges. Of course, Marcellus remained unaware of why Siegfried fled from his embrace every time he attempted to get closer to her. If he had known of the severe suffering his mother had inflicted on the woman in her youth, or the repeated beatings she received for gazing upon him fondly during their adolescent years, he was liable to strike his mother as hard as he could upon their next encounter. Instead, he was forced to feel despair every time she rejected one of his advances. The only reason he hadn't given up by now was that he was smart enough to realize she had feelings for him, too. Despite this knowledge, he did not know how to coax the woman's hidden emotions out of the depths of her heart. While the Roman general and his barbarian slave internally dreaded their lot in life, a group of Suebi skirmishers hid within the confines of the nearby forest, gazing upon the Roman army as they marched through the woods, blissfully unaware that they had been surrounded. The leader of this armed group of barbarians was a large and fierce man named Selmarus. He was the chieftain of one of the many Suebi tribes that had infiltrated into Roman Gaul after crossing the Rhine. Since then, he and his men had been terrorizing the Roman province. Though the usurper Constantine III had allied with some tribes like the Franks, others were still ravaging the landscape while murdering, looting, raping, and raiding their way across Gaul. The fact that barbarians like these could run freely in Roman lands at all was a testament to just how weak the empire had become over the past few centuries. Selmarus wore the skin of a wolf over his head, signifying that he was a mighty wolf warrior. Beneath this wolfskin cloak was an iron spangenhelm, which protected his skull from oncoming blows. Adorned across his broad chest and the rest of his torso was a mail coat, which showed he held significant wealth as a tribal warrior. The man's sharp blue eyes glared into the distance and witnessed the sight of a platinum blonde-haired woman latched around the Roman general with a collar around her neck and a loving smile on her pretty face. He could instantly tell by her features that she was likely to be of Suebi descent. The very idea that the Romans had enslaved his people and turned them into their playthings filled his black heart with rage. As such, he immediately shouted in the Suebi tongue for his warriors to advance on the marching Roman army. They were near enough by for the Romans to hear the echo of the shout resounding throughout the trees. Thus, Marcellus was quick to get into action. Enemy ambush, testudo formation. Rather than press forward on horseback in this challenging terrain, Marcellus instantly dismounted from his horse and raised his shield in the air as he dragged Sigefrida into the center of the shield wall, which formed a tortoise shell around him and his men. Arrows were launched from within the woods, into the Roman formation, crashing against the shields, and sticking to them like pincushions as the barbarian warriors charged towards them. Marcellus smirked as he made a snarky comment to his slave about the situation they found themselves in. "Aren't you glad you were by my side now?" Sigefrida was far too frightened to comment on this properly. Instead, she clung closely to her master, afraid that she would lose her life when separated from him. Tears streamed from her beautiful blue eyes as Marcellus grinned from ear to ear with excitement. As he did so, he roared out to the men next to him with an authoritative voice. "This is where the fun begins. Right, boys." The Romans immediately chanted their battle cry as the barbarian warriors rushed against their shield wall. The moment the enemy clanged against it, the formation stood firm. Instead, the blades of the Roman soldiers protruded through the gaps. They thrusted towards the bodies of the barbarian warriors, ripping into their flesh and spilling their blood as their corpses fell to the ground. Sigefrida refused to open her eyes as she held on to her dear master. Though such a thing made it difficult for him to fight back, Marcellus still managed to thrust his blade into an oncoming enemy. The barbarian warriors attempted to batter away at the shields of the Roman soldiers. Still, they would not break. Eventually, they withdrew from their futile actions and stood nearby, waiting for the Romans to respond. Yet the Romans did not fall prey to the trick, as Marcellus continued to order his soldiers. "Hold strong. Do not break ranks." Upon seeing that the Romans chose to hide behind their shields like a bunch of cowardly turtles, Selmarus called out in his native tongue towards the formation. Though he knew it was unlikely that any of the Romans spoke his language, it was not the Romans he addressed, rather the beautiful slave he had seen before the attack. "Pretty woman. Tell your Roman masters what I say to them, and I promise you that after I have slaughtered these bastards, I will spare your life." Sigefrida's ice-blue eyes widened in shock as she realized the barbarian chieftain was speaking to her. Just when she was about to curse him out, Marcellus gazed over at her and realized that they were dealing with the Suebi yet again. As such, he quickly asked his loyal slave to translate for him. "What are they saying?" The beautiful blonde woman stared away from her master with an enraged expression before revealing what the chieftain had said. This immediately caused Marcellus to smirk, as he could quickly tell how furious she was. However, he merely placed his hand on her shoulder and gave her encouragement to continue. "Go ahead, translate my words. I'd love to see what this barbarian has to say." what started as a Swaby ambush had now resulted in a negotiation between two hostile parties, the result of which had yet to be determined. Chapter 5: A Savage Duel. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Siegfrieda let out a deep sigh as she followed her master's orders. She quickly translated the conversation between Marcellus and the barbarian chieftain known as Selmarus. Thus, Marcellus began to negotiate with his enemy while hidden under a shell of shields. If you have come to make demands of Rome, I am afraid that I do not negotiate with barbarians. Selmarus spat upon the ground after hearing the Roman general's words spoken in his tongue via proxy. After doing so, he loudly boasted of his identity and various achievements in battle. I am Selmarus, wolf warrior of the god Woden, slayer of 1,000 men in single combat. I have put hundreds of Romans to the sword, but never have I slain a general. I choose you. Come out and fight me like a man. Within the confines of the shield wall, Siegfrieda conveyed the barbarian's words to Marcellus, who began to laugh upon hearing such a thing. Tell me, Selmarus, if I were to resort to such foolishness, what is to stop you and your men from raining your arrows upon us the moment I agree to your terms and lower my shield wall? Selmarus immediately responded with a scoff as if he were offended by the very notion. Afterward, he began to speak once more. I swear on my honor as a warrior that our duel will be sacred and that no man among my ranks will interfere. If I were to break this oath, then may my soul never enter Woden's hall. Marcellus could not believe his ears upon hearing such a phrase. Truly, this man must have a great desire to add his head to the ranks of men that he had killed. Such an oath was not to be taken lightly among the warriors of Germania. The Roman general struggled to come to a conclusion. After all, what benefit could such a risk possibly pose to him or his soldiers? Thus, he inquired further about the offer. What happens if I kill you in this sacred duel of ours? Selmarus broke out into intense laughter as he heard this notion escape from the luscious lips of the Swaby slave girl hidden beside the Roman general's side. It was not just the chieftain who broke out into a state of uncontrollable howling, but the thousands of men by his side as well. Their echoes filled the forests of Gaul, frightening the lesser creatures who dwelled within. It took a few moments for the barbarian chieftain to calm down before responding to the Roman's comment. In the unlikely event that you manage to defeat me in single combat and claim my life, then I vow on my honor and that of my people that you and your army will be free to continue your march without my tribe getting in your way any further. If we break this oath, then may our souls never reach the halls of our ancestors. Marcellus was astounded at the lengths this barbarian was going through to ensure a duel with him. The young general gazed around at his troops and then at Siegfrieda. If anything were to happen to her, he would not forgive himself. Thus with great resolve, he uttered forth his decree. Lower your shields. The moment he said this, Siegfrieda and the men beneath Marcellus' command alike began to interject, unwilling to allow their general to walk into a trap. Dominus, no. General, you can't. However, Marcellus' mind was made up. Thus, he patted Siegfrieda on her head and smiled before giving the order once more. I said lower your shields, damn it. The moment he cried out this command, the shield wall crumbled, revealing thousands of Swaby warriors surrounding Marcellus and his men within the forest. If blood could be avoided by killing this single barbarian, Marcellus would take up this duel. After all, their goal was not to deal with this rabble, but the usurper Constantine III. Though driving the barbarians from the diocese of Gaul was another objective, it was secondary, and the young Roman general wanted every soldier he could muster for the fight against the usurper and his armies. Marcellus gazed upon Selmarus, who met his glance with a fierce glare of his own. There was a smug expression on the man's face as he stood at the front of his army. As Marcellus stepped forth towards the man, he uttered another command to his men. Be calm, do not interfere with our duel until it is complete. If I die, then so be it, make sure to avenge my loss. Though the soldiers beneath his command wanted to object, they saw the determined glance in their general's eyes and immediately stood firm, praying to God that he might be saved. Marcellus paid no attention to the men beneath his command. Instead, he raised his spada and scutum into a fighting position before grinning at the barbarian commander. "Whenever you are ready." With that said, the duel was on, and the two men charged at each other with weapons in hand. The chieftain known as Selmarus immediately thrust his spear towards Marcellus, which his scutum deflected before Marcellus pressed forward and attacked with a vicious stab of his own. The barbarian warrior easily deflected the jab of his blade with his shield before thrusting yet again with his spear towards the gaps between Marcellus and his armor. Yet, Marcellus dodged the oncoming blow as he slashed towards the neck of his opponent. The two warriors were locked in a dance of death as both sides cheered for their representative. Before long, Marcellus managed to spill the first blood by slashing his opponent's thigh. As the man's blood spilled onto the floor, it seemed not to harm him. Instead, he took advantage of the opportunity to jab his spearhead into the shoulder of Marcellus. Unfortunately for the barbarian, the thick bronze scales of the Roman general's larica squamata easily deflected the oncoming blow, and Marcellus noticed an opening. Thus, he thrust his spada forward towards the rib cage of his enemy right beneath the heart. However, the barbarian chieftain dodged just in time, and thus, the sword pierced through the rings of the mail coat but failed to tear through flesh. Before Marcellus could withdraw his weapon and react, he was kicked across the chest with a push kick, sending him backward into the mud below. The barbarian warriors on the sides erupted in cheers as they witnessed their chieftain hurl his spear towards the downed opponent. Despite this attempt to skewer Marcellus like a pig, the Roman general rolled out of the way and towards a standing position, charging forth towards his enemy like a wild boar. Selmarus immediately unleashed his sword and engaged in mortal combat with the Roman standing before him. The two men were locked in a ruthless struggle as their weapons clashed against wood and steel alike, one man never gaining too serious of an advantage. The battle lasted for a few minutes before both men were gasping for breath. Finally, Marcellus moved forward with a slash towards the neck of the opponent, which Selmarus attempted to dodge. However, before he could, the cut turned into a thrust where the Noric steel blade of the Romans' general's spada embedded itself in the barbarian chieftain's neck, piercing entirely through the other side. The barbarians gazed in horror as their commander fell to his knees before Marcellus withdrew his blade via a vicious slash, severing Selmarus' head in the process. After doing so, he wiped his bloodied blade on the man's trousers before staring at the barbarians with a murderous glare. Though the Suebi wanted to avenge their master, they were profoundly superstitious and came to their senses as they remembered the vow that he had taken. If they were to act now, then indeed neither Selmarus nor their own souls would find their way to the afterlife of the valiant dead. Thus, there was utter silence for a time before Marcellus returned to the men under his command, who watched in awe as their commander eliminated the barbarian chieftain in single combat. He helped Sigefrida upon horseback with a slight push before climbing up himself. After doing so, he gave his command to his soldiers. Forward march. With this said, the Romans recovered from their stupor before advancing back onto the path they had taken before the enemy ambush. The Suebi warriors gazed in awe at the man who had killed their chieftain, staying their hand as they did so, for to act against Selmarus' wishes would surely damn their souls for eternity. Sigefrida clung to Marcellus' back once more, smelling his musk as she did so. The bravery of her master had left a deep imprint on her heart. She swore she would never forget this day. Thus, with the barbarian commander's death, the Romans were back on the path towards Valence. As for the Suebi tribe, which allowed them to pass, they swore that they would get their vengeance upon the Roman who had killed their chieftain one day. Chapter 6 Arriving on the borders of Valence. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus rode upon the back of his horse, latching on to his body was his Suebi slave Sigefrida. Even though the woman had just witnessed him kill a member of her people, she had a warm and loving smile as she spent the journey towards their destination, holding on to the man she deeply admired. Days had passed since the Roman army had been ambushed by the Suebi tribesmen, and now they were within range of the Gallo-Roman city of Valence. On the hills above were the Roman legions under Marcellus' command. they slowly descended into the valley to surround the city. The young general gazed at the target in the distance with a look of disdain spread across his lips. The traitors and their federati allies were garrisoned within the city. Thus, it was his duty to either drive them out or slaughter them to the last man. Upon reaching the ideal position, Marcellus cried out his commands with a booming voice to the soldiers beneath his authority. Set up the encampment. I want a proper siege camp established and our catapults built. We will be here for some time, boys. Upon hearing their general utter his commands, the Roman soldiers and their federati allies were quick to do as instructed. Sarus gazed upon Marcellus with contempt, but ultimately, he followed orders. After all, to get on the wrong side of the Marcellus who was so well known for slaying Goths was not something that he wished to do. Within hours, a proper siege camp was established around the perimeter of the Gallo-Roman city. The citizens within were frightened beyond measure as they witnessed the sight of their garrison sealing off the exits. War had finally come to Valence, and with it, the civilians who dwelled within had no way out. They prayed to God that the Roman legions might be merciful to them. After all, it was not their fault that Gaul had fallen into the hands of a usurper. However, such a thing was unlikely, as it was common practice to lay waste to the population that dwelled within a city which refused to surrender. While this was going on, Marcellus personally established his command tent in the center of the encampment and led Sigefrida inside. He would not allow any form of harm to come to her so long as he yet drew breath. After placing down the cot and the bedding, he beckoned for the woman to join him by his side. Though it was far from the hour of the day where he might receive rest. The young general wanted to say a few words to the woman before things turned bloody. This had become standard practice for the two of them whenever they went on campaigns. Marcellus grasped a hold of his slave's dainty ivory hands and kissed them gently before revealing the thoughts that he dreaded every moment of every hour while on a campaign. If something were to happen to me during this siege, I want you to do whatever is necessary to flee the encampment. Take whatever precautions that are required to regroup with your people and inform them that you have escaped bondage. Do not, under any circumstances, return to the empire. It will not be safe for you there as a runaway slave. Benoel Sigefrida sighed heavily as she nodded her pretty head in silence. She had heard different variations of this same speech for the past few years, ever since Marcellus had ascended to an officer position and had taken her with him into war. Internally, the slave woman had never actually thought about escaping with her life should her master die in battle. As far as she was concerned, their fates were intertwined. Nevertheless, she comforted him by agreeing to his terms. After saying his piece, Marcellus stood up from his seat and wore a bitter smile as he informed his slave of his current intentions. I am going to go help get the camp established. As always, stay within the confines of my tent, and if anyone tries anything, use one of the daggers which I have hidden to eliminate them. I do not care what their rank is, I will protect you. Many men with the ranks of his field army and federati allies alike wanted a piece of Sigefrida. However, fear of Marcellus' reputation was the only thing that kept their sinister hands at bay. After giving this warning, the young general left the tent, where Sigefrida began to write in her diary of the events that had come to pass these last few days. Though a lowly slave, Marcellus had ensured that she was in fact literate so that she could aid him in more than simply domestic duties. Thus, she was quite the commodity within the empire, as in these dark times fewer Roman citizens could read and write by the day, let alone common slaves. As for Marcellus, he quickly got to work helping his men establish the remainder of the encampment. By the time the sun fell from the sky, a proper siege camp had been set up, and the catapults began to rain their projectiles down upon the walls of the city. For the next few weeks, the Roman legion would do everything in their power to bring an end to the reign of the usurper and his minions over this city. As for Marcellus, he decided to take the first watch. Thus, he was up alone in a watchtower, gazing upon Valence from an aerial position. There was not much worthy of note. The fires of the city's denizens plumed from their chimneys as they presumably huddled for warmth within the confines of their homes. The traders who defended the city were on guard, if Marcellus looked closely, he could see them staring back at him from their watchtowers. As he was gazing upon the hostile city, Marcellus heard the sound of wood creaking as a man climbed the makeshift steps up into the temporary watchtower. Standing behind Marcellus was none other than the Gothic chieftain Sarus. He wore a grim expression on his face as he recounted what he had heard from the scouts who had first laid eyes upon the city and its defenders. My scouts report that at least several thousand men are stationed within the city. Quite a large force for a mere garrison. Are you certain we will be able to take it? Marcellus scoffed when he heard these words. Of course, they could take the city, but it would not be without shedding a fair degree of blood. Obviously, he would never actually admit to this fact. Thus, he presented a confident facade as he answered the Gothic chieftain's question. Yes, I am quite certain that we will take this city. However, it all depends on the efforts of your men and mine. If even one of the soldiers beneath our command refuses to play their part, then more blood than necessary will be spilled to seize this city. Marcellus gazed fiercely upon his Federati commander as he emphasized this last point. His intent was clear. Should the Federati deliberately fail to perform their duties, then every single one of them would suffer at his hands. Sarus sighed heavily as he nodded his head in silence. However, before departing, he had another question on his mind, and thus he asked it with a fierce glint in his eyes. Remember our deal. We Goths get the first pick of any loot that comes with the conquest of a city. Marcellus did not hesitate to nod his head in silence. To buy the loyalty of the Federati under his command, he had to make certain concessions such as spoils of war. Though he did not like it, negotiations with the barbarians were necessary to secure their fighting prowess. Upon seeing the agreeable expression of the Roman general, Sarus grinned with excitement before pounding his chest in a barbaric gesture. Very well, then. I will assure you that every warrior beneath my command will do their best to take this city. After saying these words, Sarus departed, leaving the Marcellus by his lonesome. Though the Federati commander had guaranteed his allegiance, they were, after all, mere words. Words which were spoken by a barbarian, nonetheless. Thus, if Marcellus wanted to ensure his survival and the men beneath his command, he would have to take certain precautions. Marcellus would stay on watch for another 3 hours before being relieved of duty. When he finally returned to his tent, he witnessed Sigfrida sitting on the bed with a worried expression. It was only after she saw the safe return of her master did she become less distressed. Before long, she aided Marcellus as he stripped out of his gear. After doing so, the master and slave lay within the same cot, where the Roman general wrapped his body securely around that of Suebi Beauty. The two would soon fall asleep in each other's arms as they had done so many nights before. What awaited them on the morrow was yet to be determined. Chapter 7 The Siege of Valence Part 1 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus gripped the hilt of his spada with all the power that his hand could muster. The blade was withdrawn from its sheath and held tightly by his side. No matter how many times he faced the field of battle, there was always an intense feeling of anxiety deep within his gut. Yet mixed with this overwhelming sense of dread was also a state of euphoria, as if his instincts were heightened and his strength raised. The feeling that anything and everything could be accomplished if he would only charge forth and destroy the obstacles in his path. It had been weeks since his field army had established a siege camp around the Gallo-Roman city of Valence, and now the Romans and their Federati allies surrounded the army of the Frankish chieftain Nebiogastes, who had sworn his allegiance to the usurper Constantine III. Any minute now, the thick wooden gate of the Gallo-Roman city would break apart. The sturdy wooden gates began to crack with the repeated crash of the iron ram's head. Before long, it was utterly blasted apart. Finally, after weeks of grueling siege warfare, a gap had opened in the enemy's defenses. Upon gazing down at the visible traitors behind the city's splintered gates, Marcellus gave the command as he raised his shield above his head to block the oncoming missile fire. Charge! With those words spoken, 10,000 men rushed towards the gap in the enemy's defenses, with their young general leading the charge. 1 foot turned to 10, then 100, then 1,000 with each step taken. The blood pumped from Marcellus' heart to the rest of his body, forcing him ever closer into the fray until finally the steel contained within his hand thrust towards its initial target and burst through the enemy's chest, spewing forth blood across the field of battle. The echoing roar of thousands of men and their weapons clashing against one another filled the surrounding air as the hands of the Roman army had drawn first blood, and it was none other than Marcellus who scored this feat. The young Roman general immediately withdrew his blade from the torso of the slain hostile and raised his shield to block an oncoming spear. It was not only the foederati under the command of Nebiogastes that Marcellus had to contend with. There were also the traitor legions who had supported the usurper in his false claim towards the empire stationed within the Gallo, Roman city. The spear thrust itself onto his wooden scutum, yet there was not enough force to break through the barrier. This allowed Marcellus to push off with his shield and thrust towards the belly of his next target. Though this man wore a mail coat to protect his vitals from enemy attacks, the Noric steel blade of the Roman general Sparta tore its way through the iron links and embedded itself in the enemy's guts. Marcellus withdrew his blade once more, spilling blood and bile across his armor before launching a skillful slash towards the neck of a nearby opponent. Despite this effort, his sword was reflected by the enemy's shield, and he was pushed back onto his off step. However, before Marcellus could fall backward, the soldier behind him pushed the general forward with his shield, forcing Marcellus back into mortal combat on the front lines. Marcellus did not falter as he once more unleashed his blade upon his enemies, shield against shield, steel against steel. He fought with all his strength as he thrust his sword into the neck of the enemy standing before him. As the blood gushed open from the wound like a broken fountain, he was instantly reminded of that strange dream he had endured not long ago and could intensely feel the pain he suffered from during his brief time spent in that foreign world. However, the clang of an enemy's sword against his helmet instantly brought him back to reality as he continued to push forward into the gap against the defending traitor legion and their barbarian allies. With each small step taken, the bodies of both enemies and allies alike fell to the ground, the life forever escaping from their eyes. Sarus gazed upon the Roman legions from the hill above as they fought their way through the gap in Valence's defenses. The conflict had begun to reach a stalemate as the combat continued. The traitor legions skillfully utilized the opening in the gate as a choke point to allow the Roman armies to push through a few men at a time. Despite Marcellus' best efforts, ultimately, he was forced to retreat, as the men by his side fell beside him one at a time. Fall back. Upon hearing the general's orders, the Roman legions retreated to the line where their siege weapons stood proudly with the intent to regroup and re-assault the enemy position. After reaching the location of the foederati and the siege weapons, Marcellus sighed heavily. Though their losses weren't severe, if they continued to fight in such a manner, it would only be a matter of time before his army was depleted. Victory may be assured, but like Pyrrhus at Asculum, the losses would indeed affect the remainder of his campaign. He needed another strategy to bring the traitors who dwelled within the city to justice and continue the fight against the usurper Constantine III. With this in mind, Marcellus quickly issued an order to the men gathered in his army. I want ladders constructed and up against the ramparts during the next wave of attack. Though the gate has been breached, it is not enough to win this battle. Upon seeing the young general retreat from the battle, Sarus spit on the ground in disgust, which did not go unnoticed by Marcellus, who trod towards the barbarian chieftain with a face filled with rage. Where the hell were you? Your forces were supposed to be in the front lines, and yet not even one of your barbarian corpses lie in the field below. Do your fucking job, or I will send you to the afterlife myself. Sarus snarled in disdain as he heard these orders. He had purposely withheld his forces so that the Romans would face the brunt of the carnage. However, the glare in Marcellus' olive-green eyes told him that if he made such a choice again, it would be his head that rolled next. As such, the Gothic chieftain nodded his head in obedience, even if he felt like refusing the orders that he had received. With this internal drama settled, the army sat back and watched as dozens of stones were thrown towards the walls from the catapults. During this time, the ladders had been constructed and prepared for the next attack. Marcellus glared at Sarus before giving him another order, as this was ongoing. Since your men hid on the hilltop like a bunch of cowards during the last charge, it is your turn to lead the next wave. Your soldiers will be the vanguard that breaches the gate. Sarus roared like a wild beast before placing his helmet upon his head. As he did so, he screamed in the Gothic language to the Federati under his command. Charge! Kill any man who gets in your way. With this said, thousands of Gothic warriors ran down the hillside screaming their battle cries, charging towards the shattered city gates and the brave men who defended them. While the Goths rushed towards the city's gatehouse, the Romans led their ladders towards the ramparts, where they began to climb atop the city's walls. For the second time in one day, the young general charged forth at the head of his forces into the fray. Arrows rained down upon him and his troops from the ramparts above, only to splinter against the thick wooden scutum that his soldiers possessed. The Roman army rushed towards the traitor legion and their Federati allies without the slightest hint of fear in their eyes. For in their minds, there was but a single thought. What was an individual life worth when compared to the glory of Rome? The battle continued to wage on, as both sides fought with every fiber of their being to be victorious. As Marcellus slashed his sword towards the collar of a hostile soldier standing atop the wall, he cut through his target as if his neck were made of butter, decapitating the man in the process. Blood spewed from the severed nape as the head tumbled over the edge of the wall. Despite slaying a fellow Roman in battle, Marcellus felt no sympathy, for this man, like those around him, was a traitor to Rome, and the penalty for treason was death. Marcellus would not suffer these traitors to live, even if it were the last thing he accomplished in this world. He swore to kill every man who pledged their allegiance to the usurper Constantine III. Thus, the battle reached a new level of intensity as the sun fell from the sky. On this battlefield, only a single scent prevailed, which was the smell of blood. One thing was certain, this battle was far from finished. Chapter 8 The Siege of Valence Part 2 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Blood flowed through the double fullers along the flat of Marcellus' blade, pooling into the guard of his spatha's hilt. A pile of corpses lies between him and the city's walls. He and his men had successfully made their way down the ramparts. Yet, despite the progress that his army had made, the city's defenders still stood, as the traitors courageously fought with the entirety of their resolve in the name of a usurper. If these men weren't traitors, Marcellus might have some respect for them, and yet they were, in fact, nothing more than a treasonous lot. Thus, he acted without mercy as he slashed the edge of his blade towards his opponent's neck. The blade cut through the flesh and bone and severed the man's head from his neck, spilling more blood across the field of battle. After doing so, he instantly raised his shield to deflect the oncoming weapon of an enemy Federati. While the spear embedded itself within the wooden scutum, Marcellus swung his sword down onto its shaft, breaking it apart with the heft of his blade. If not for the stress placed upon the shaft of the spear from being stuck within his shield, Marcellus doubted he would have been able to pull off such a feat. Upon seeing that his primary weapon had been broken, the barbarian warrior quickly unleashed his spatha, which contained a hilt in the style used by the Germanic tribes. The two men swung their swords simultaneously as they clashed in the air, sending both men onto the back step. While the Roman general and the barbarian warrior were embattled in a deadly dance, the soldiers around them clashed against one another, creating a concert of carnage. With each second, another man's blood spilled onto the floor, and a life was taken. As this bloodshed occurred, Marcellus was quick to attack, as he slashed forward with his spatha in a feigned attempt to cut the man's chest. Just when the man went to block such an attack with his shield, the young general transitioned to a thrust, which found its way into the man's neck, and out the other side. The look of shock in the barbarian's eyes as his soul faded was utterly insignificant in the mind of Marcellus. He did not care in the slightest, for the man was not only a barbarian but an oath-breaker, who had taken up arms in defense of the usurper Constantine III. With this in mind, Marcellus ruthlessly cut away at the men before him, like a sickle to a field of wheat. A lifetime of militant training had prepared him not only for the battlefield but for a position of command as well, turning him into a merciless butcher who cut apart the flesh of those who fought against him. As he was fighting with yet another opponent, the cries of the loyalist Federati resounded throughout the air as they charged forward into the center of the city, killing any man in sight while suffering from a state of pure, concentrated rage. The Romans and their allies had finally regrouped in the center of the city. Marcellus smirked as he gazed upon the frightened defenders. The Romans advanced forth against the traitors with heightened ferocity. Steel clashed with steel, bodies were torn asunder, and the angel of death descended upon the field of battle to claim the souls of those brave warriors who had perished. Despite the combined assault from the Romans and their Federati, the conflict soon became a stalemate. Both sides failed to push each other back even an inch. Eventually, a distance of 15 feet was established. Marcellus stood at the front of his forces, with Sarus and Lucan by his side. As for the enemy army, they were represented by the villainous Nebiogastes and his allied legionary commanders. Both sides were marred with blood and exhausted beyond measure, thus when Nebiogastes strode forth into the center with a white flag in his hand, Marcellus took the opportunity for his soldiers to rest. However, he personally had no desire to converse with a barbarian and a traitor. Instead, Marcellus left that task to a man of equal standing with Nebiogastes. The young Roman general walked over to his Federati commander and whispered something into his ears. A look of shock appeared on the barbarian's face, followed by a wicked grin. After the message was delivered, Sarus sheathed his blade and strode forth to meet Nebiogastes in the center, between their two armies. When he finally arrived, Nebiogastes was shocked to see that the Romans had chosen a Federati commander to represent them in this brief parley. Thus, he spoke in his native tongue as he tried to ascertain who this barbarian was and where he came from. "Tell me, brother, which tribe do you hail from?" Sarus scoffed as he heard this before speaking in the Frankish tongue. "I am a mighty Goth, something a Frank like yourself should fear." Immediately Nebiogastes frowned when he heard this. Out of all the other tribes, this man had to be a filthy Goth from the east. However, if it meant driving these Romans out of Gaul, he was more than happy to work beside the Gothic chieftain. With this in mind, Nebiogastes reached his hand out in friendship as he proposed a conspiracy. "A proud Goth, and yet you kneel before the boot of a Roman. Tell me, what do they offer you to fight so fiercely for them?" Sarus chuckled when he heard this before commenting on his own. "I was about to ask you the same question. You fight for a usurper in Gaul, while there are other tribes such as the Vandals and Suebi who seek to claim this land for themselves. Surely Constantine must have offered you something substantial to do so." Despite being asked this question, Nebiogastes deflected by making an interesting proposition to the Gothic chieftain. "Truly, you don't enjoy fighting and dying for this Roman scum, do you? How about you join us? Together we can drive that man and his legions from these lands, then we can overthrow Constantine and become the rulers of Gaul." Sarus had to admit it was an enticing offer, and he thoroughly despised Marcellus. Luckily for him, the Roman did not speak the Frankish tongue and thus could not understand what they were talking about. A wicked smile formed on the Gothic chieftain's face as he considered the option before slowly nodding his head. "Very well, I accept your offer." Lucan gazed upon the negotiations with an overwhelming sense of dread. As the conversation between the Sarus and Nebiogastes became more cordial, he could no longer bite his tongue. "I don't like the look of this. Sir, what are your orders? We can't allow these two barbarians to align against us." Despite the anxiety that his soldiers were suffering from, Marcellus had a calm expression and a cruel smirk upon his lips as he issued forth a decree unto his army. "Stay your hand. We will see these negotiations through to the end." The Romans beneath Marcellus' command stared at him in disbelief as Sarus and Nebiogastes shook hands. The Roman legionaries felt their hilts rattle within their trembling fingers while they waited for their Federati allies to turn on them. However, right when Nebiogastes turned around to give the order to attack, Sarus pulled out his blade and drove it through the Frankish chieftain's back. The cold steel pierced its way through the barbarian's heart as he stared at the protruding edge in disbelief. The moment Nebiogastes' body dropped to the floor, Sarus yelled at the Frankish warriors in a fearsome tone. Turn on your traitorous masters or suffer the same fate as your commander. The decision is in your hands to make. It did not take the Franks long to come to a proper course of action. They quickly attacked the traitor legions of Rome, instantly turning the tides of battle. As the Franks began to slay their former allies, Marcellus screamed his orders to all the men beneath his command. Kill the traitors. Spare no man who swears allegiance to the usurper. With that said, the traitor legions gazed in horror as their allies turned against them, struggling to resist the attacks unleashed upon them. However, they were far too outnumbered to fight their enemies. One by one, they fell to the blade and the spear alike as their lives were snuffed from existence. In the end, the city had returned to the hands of their Roman masters, and Marcellus had lived up to his words. Not a single soul who had sworn their allegiance to the usurper was spared on this night. Blood flowed through the streets, and bodies lay piled into small hills. Nebiogastes was dead, having been deceived and betrayed by Sarus during the negotiations. While the Roman soldiers and their Federati allies ransacked the city for its worth, Sarus stood by Marcellus' side as the two men watched the ongoing plunder. The young Roman general could not help but ask the question on his mind, was there ever a point during the negotiations where you genuinely considered the offer that he made you? Sarus gazed upon Marcellus in astonishment as he heard this question. He knew much about his commanding officer and was confident that he did not speak Frankish. As such, he could not help but inquire about it as an awkward atmosphere filled the air. How did you know? As far as I am aware, you do not speak the Frankish tongue. Marcellus chuckled softly before revealing his hand. The more he spoke, the less friendly his tone became. I don't, but I figured Nebiogastes would make a play to turn you against me. So, allow me to reiterate, was there ever a point during the negotiations where you genuinely considered the offer that he made you? Upon hearing the chilling tone beneath Marcellus' words, Sarus gulped the saliva that had pooled itself upon his tongue before answering the question honestly. His offer was fairly enticing. To finally be rid of you would be a blessing for my people. Marcellus knew that was not the end of the man's statement. Thus, a sadistic grin formed itself upon his lips as he asked for clarification. But, after hearing that Marcellus was one step ahead of him, Sarus chuckled before revealing his thoughts. But, I am sure you would find some way to survive, you always do. No, if I were to truly turn on you, I am certain that I would be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life in fear that I would become yet another Goth put down by your blade. Marcellus broke out into laughter as he heard this response, and Sarus joined him. After a few moments, the two men finally silenced themselves, where Marcellus began to depart. After a few steps, he halted his movement before looking back and gazing upon Sarus with a terrifying smile. You would do best to remember that fact. After saying this, Marcellus continued forward, leaving Sarus in a state of petrification as he thanked the gods that he was wise enough not to betray the Roman general, thus concluding the siege of Valence. Chapter 9 The Aftermath. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus stood within a villa that once belonged to a wealthy patrician of Gallo, Roman descent. What exactly was the fate of this man and his family? That remained unknown to the young general. After all, Gaul had been a rather tumultuous region for centuries. At the moment, yet another campaign was being fought in the Roman province of Gaul in an attempt to oust the usurper Constantine III. Though Valence was reclaimed, and Nebiogastes was slain, the city was far from peaceful. Instead, as if making a deal with the devil, Marcellus had allowed the Gothic Federati beneath his command to ravage the town and plunder its values. This had become a common practice among the Roman armies, as they now heavily relied on the support of the barbarian Federati, and their loyalty could only be bought with wealth, something that the Western Roman Empire was severely lacking in at the moment. While the city bled in the background, Marcellus stood in this lonesome villa gazing upon the fires raging in the town below. A chalice of wine was in his hand, and his beautiful slave was by his side. Sigefrida clung tightly to Marcellus' body as she watched him gaze upon the destruction wrought by his command. She knew such chaos weighed heavily on the conscience of her master, and yet there was nothing she could do to abate it. As for Marcellus, he drank his sorrows away with the wine stored in the cellar of this villa. It was far from his favorite vintage, but at the very least, it was strong enough to cure what ails him. Or so he thought. Yet despite the increase in intoxication, the young Roman's fists continued to clench themselves tighter and tighter. Marcellus had every desire to unsheath his blade and hunt down the Goths who made up his foederati one by one, skewering their heads onto posts outside the Gallo, Roman city, and yet he was forced to hide this desire deep in the labyrinth of his heart. After all, he could not afford to be rid of the barbarian warriors who helped him achieve victory. Ultimately, the silence was broken as Siegfrieda poured herself a chalice of the sweet red wine and drank its contents. The sound of her gulping down the liquid was enough to break Marcellus' line of thought. His olive-green eyes shifted over towards the barbarian beauty, and with it, his expression relaxed. If she was by his side, he could easily endure the torment that his morally questionable orders inflicted upon his soul. "I am glad to see you are all right. I don't know what I would do if something happened to you." No matter how many times she heard her master say these words, it always left a tinge of desire upon her heart. Yet, every time she felt like she should act upon her impulse, a single phrase resounded throughout Siegfrieda's mind, instantly deterring her from taking that last step in the relationship between herself and Marcellus. After calming her heart, the Swaby woman swallowed a sip of wine before responding to her master's kind words. "Nothing bad can happen to me so long as you remain in command of your legions." There was utter confidence in the tone of her voice as she expressed these words. She truly believed that so long as Marcellus remained in command, he would defeat all the enemies he was to face. After all, she had witnessed his talent for military matters since he was a young boy, studying the feats of distinguished men of years past. Pyrrhus, Hannibal, Alexander, and even Cyrus were all men he looked up to, and none were Romans. As for the Roman generals of the past, he could always look up to Marius, Scipio Africanus, and Germanicus. Yet, there was one Roman whose accomplishments stood above all others, and if only he had lived longer, then perhaps the empire would not be in its current state of decay. This man was Emperor Aurelian, the restorer of the world and champion of the great deity Sol Invictus. This man was Marcellus' idol, and he hoped Rome would one day see another Aurelian among its children. However, as things currently stood, he was beginning to feel doubtful about this scenario ever occurring. After all, when he looked around and gazed upon the state of the city of Valence, he could only feel despair. As such, he gazed over at his lovely slave with a bitter expression before speaking the thoughts on his mind. "We are truly living at the end of days. Even if I am to bring this usurper to justice, what then? There will be another pretender 5 years down the line, if not then 10. Honorius is an indolent fool who sits back and watches his empire bleed. The only wise thing he has ever done is abide by his father's wishes and entrust Stilicho with the position of supreme commander over Rome's legions. The day my godfather passes from this world is the day that Rome breathes its last breath. Though I suppose that would be a good thing for you." Siegfrieda gazed upon her master with a pouting expression. She knew exactly what he meant by this. Marcellus could never live in a world without Rome, and he would rather die defending its last breath than live on without it. With his death and Rome's demise, she would be a free woman, but that was not something the enslaved enchantress desired. While Marcellus may not be able to live without Rome, Siegfrieda could not live without her master. She would rather fall on a sword than witness him give his life in service to a dying empire. As such, she wore an equally bitter expression on her face as she grabbed hold of his hands with her own. She gazed into his eyes, with her ice-blue irises as she professed the feelings contained within her heart and soul. "The day you meet your end is the day that I shall also perish." Despite the grim nature of her statement, it brought a smile to Marcellus' face. She was indeed the most loyal companion he could ask for. Unfortunately for him, something deep within the woman's fragile heart kept her from being with him intimately. Truthfully, he did not know what had caused her to refuse his advances, but if she did not want to talk about it, then he would not push it. Instead, Marcellus drank from his chalice filled with wine once more while he held on to his slave's hand. The two of them gazed upon the burning city in the distance with an overwhelming sense of despair. Maybe it indeed was the end of days that they were living in, but that did not mean that Marcellus would go quietly into the night. He would give everything he had in service to Rome. It was just a shame that a rotten emperor currently ruled it. If only they had a man like Aurelian at the helm. Hell, at this point, Marcellus would take someone akin to Gallienus. At least that man was competent enough to prevent the empire from completely collapsing around him. The same could not be said for Honorius. As the couple gazed upon the blazing scene, Sigefrida asked the question that was currently troubling her conscience. What now? You have lost quite some troops in this battle. Do you believe that you will be able to depose Constantine? Marcellus did not immediately answer this question. Instead, he took several gulps of the wine contained in his gilded chalice before responding. For now, we will consolidate our gains. As for the Franks who have sided with us against their former masters, I will ensure that they swear their servitude to the glory of Rome in exchange for their lives. They can make up for the losses we have suffered during this siege. Once our army is fully prepared, we will march on Lugdunum. An awkward silence filled the air. Sigefrida had struggled to find the courage to ask the question on her mind, but ultimately, she decided to use the same tactic as her master and down some more of the liquid courage in her cup. After taking several large gulps, to the point where the red fluid was spilling down the sides of her luscious pink lips, the woman finally expressed her concerns. And if you can't, take the city, I mean. Upon hearing this, Marcellus' gaze shifted from bitter to grim as he stared at Sigefrida with a solemn expression. Then I suppose you and I will enter the grave earlier than expected. After this was said, the young general and his loyal slave remained in complete and utter silence. One way or another, Marcellus would fulfill his duty, even if it meant the death of him. That was just the kind of man he was, and Sigefrida knew that there was no changing this aspect of his character. She admired it and would be filled with pride over her master's determination if it weren't for such a depressing subject. Before long, the couple retired to the villa's bedroom, where they would fall to sleep. By the time they woke up the following day, the dust would have settled, and Valence would have been plundered for all it's worth. For the Western Roman Empire, this was all too common of an occurrence. Chapter 10 An Unholy Alliance is brokered. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The dawn rose several days later, and with it so too did Marcellus. The Roman general yawned slightly as he shifted under his covers towards the side of the bed. He reached out his hand to touch his beloved slave. However, despite his attempt to feel her warmth, he merely swatted the air. This caused the man to open his eyes wide in shock as he glanced over at his bedside to notice that his slave girl was mysteriously absent. Her absence in the morning was abnormal, to say the least. Normally, Sigefrida would remain by his side until he awoke so she could properly dress him for the day, and yet there was no sight of her. In the back of his mind, there was a hint of worry. After all, she was a beautiful woman, and there were many fiends in this city who would do anything they could to get their hands on her. However, he also remembered his fierce reputation, and his strict orders given to those beneath his command. Thus, he did not immediately resort to panic and instead tried to rationalize events. His first course of action was to simply call out to the woman. Perhaps she was elsewhere within the villa, attending to other matters. Sigefrida. Are you nearby? Only the man's echoes resounded throughout the stale air of the abandoned villa. Upon realizing that the woman was not within the building, he quickly got dressed by himself before searching throughout the confines of the building in case she did not hear him. However, ultimately his investigation was futile as she was nowhere to be found, thus he headed for the door to continue his search within the city below. When he was about to exit the door to the villa, it abruptly opened and slammed him in the nose, causing him to fall back into the wall behind it. When Sigefrida saw she had accidentally harmed her master, she instantly dropped the basket of eggs, meat, and produce that she was carrying while rushing to the man's side. Marcellus, I'm so sorry I didn't see you. Are you okay? Luckily, there was nobody else nearby to overhear her casual use of the general's name. It took the man a moment or two to gather his thoughts, but in the end, he rose from his feet and wore a stern expression as he lectured the woman. Do you have any idea how worried I was? Where were you? In response to her master's worries, Siegfrieda merely smiled warmly before giving him an appropriate answer. There's no reason to worry. Have I not told you before? No harm shall come to me so long as you remain in command of your legions. I was merely out requisitioning some supplies from your quartermaster. If there is one thing that hasn't changed with the centuries, it's the organization skills of the Roman army. Upon hearing this, Marcellus chuckled before patting the woman on the head. After doing so, he smiled before nodding his head in response. Very well. In the future, make sure to leave a note before you do something like this. Also, take an escort with you. Even if we have recaptured the city, it is still dangerous out there. Since you are fine, then I will let things slide this time around. How about you cook me up some breakfast, and then we will depart from this city towards Lugdunum. Siegfrieda nodded her head with a smile on her face before responding to Marcellus's orders. I will do as you command from now on, master. After saying this, she stood up and grabbed hold of her basket. After doing so, she hummed a song as she walked off towards the kitchen area of the villa. Before long, she had coal burning on the stove and prepared her master and herself for some much-needed nutrition for the long march ahead. Time passed and before long, Siegfrieda had cooked a healthy meal from the contents of her basket. She proceeded to lay the food down on the table, where she and Marcellus said a short prayer to the gods before digging into the food. After a single bite, Marcellus moaned in delight as he complimented the woman for her cooking skills. I am always amazed at your ability to cook a decent meal, even if you are using ingredients foraged on a campaign. The Swaby beauty's ivory cheeks flushed red in embarrassment as she heard such shameless flattery. Thus, she switched the subject by inquiring about Marcellus' plans for the rest of the campaign. Tell me, Marcellus, after we have seized Lugdunum, what then? Will we meet Constantine in the field? Or will we chase him across Gaul and Hispania until we have ensured his demise? The young general did not hesitate to answer that question as he devoured the food on his plate. Ideally, I would like to force Constantine into the field where I have the advantage. If I am forced to wage too many sieges, my numbers will dwindle, and then we will be forced to retreat from this campaign. That is not something I wish to do. Siegfrieda silently nodded her head in response to this. She was no master of military matters, but she was an educated woman thanks to Marcellus' efforts. Thus, she was able to quickly discern the reasoning behind her master's intentions. With a smile on her face, she responded to this statement with a comforting remark. I believe the gods have blessed you in your endeavors. Surely you will succeed. In doing so, you will finally prove your worth to your godfather and the emperor. Perhaps they will even give you a victory title. You have more than earned it. When Marcellus heard this point, he merely scoffed in displeasure. His qualms with the current emperor were more than could be counted on one's fingers. However, he never voiced such thoughts. After all, to do so was considered treason, and he was no traitor. Instead, he merely tolerated the indolent fool who called himself emperor. Perhaps one day a man more worthy of the Roman throne would come into existence. Until then, he was stuck with Honorius. After dwelling upon this, Marcellus finished his meal, before standing up from his seat and giving Siegfrieda an order. Quickly, finish your meal, and prepare to embark. We have a long journey ahead of us, and the quicker we get a move on, the better off we will be. Siegfrieda merely pouted as she continued to eat her meal in silence. Evidently Marcellus was not in the talkative kind of mood today. After finishing her meal, she gathered her supplies alongside her master and the two of them departed towards the center of the city where the Roman army was gathered. Marcellus rode upon horseback, with his beloved slave sitting behind him, tightly wrapping her arms around his chest for stability. The Roman general gazed upon his soldiers before issuing the order to march. Men, though we have been victorious here in Valence, the enemy still holds much sway over the lands of Gaul. Thus, we will push forth to Lugdunum and remove this usurper once and for all. Forward march. With this said, the army of Romans and Foederati alike marched toward their destination. Unbeknownst to them, an unholy alliance was underway nearby. While the Romans were marching towards Lugdunum, there were two factions gathered in the woods. With Selmerus' death by the hands of Marcellus, his armies had sworn in their hearts to one day gain their vengeance. Currently, the Suebi war band was led by a man named Osoarius, who was the younger brother of the former chieftain. Shortly after Valens had fallen, Osoarius received a letter from Constantine III. The terms that were written were simple. Join forces with the traitor legions, and together they would claim the head of Marcellus. Naturally, Osoarius had no reason to refuse, and thus now the barbarian chieftain was standing side by side with one of Constantine's generals, named Aestinianus. The two men conversed with one another as their armies waiting for their negotiations to be completed. Aestinianus was the first to speak as he presented his terms. The Emperor Constantine would like to employ your men, swear your servitude to me as Foederati, and together we will avenge the death of your brother. You know as well as I that your numbers are too few to achieve victory against the loyalist forces. Osoarius scratched his beard as he contemplated on the offer presented to him. The losses his tribe had suffered at the hands of Marcellus' troop during the brief exchange of combat prior to the duel was no small number. Even before their casualties, they did not have the ability to wage battle against the Romans in an open field. However, with the traitor legions by his side, perhaps he could avenge his fallen brother, and honor his ancestors. So, what if he was allied with another Roman? Such alliances were common among the various Germanic tribes. Thus, after ample consideration, the barbarian chieftain reached out his hand and clasped onto the traitor general's forearm, signaling his agreement. With a smile on his face, Aestinianus nodded before giving his orders. Very well, we set out immediately. We cannot allow those damned loyalists to reach Lugdunum. Osoarius roared in laughter as he called out to his forces. Onward and to victory. Those Roman dogs will fear the steel in our hands as we avenge Selmerus. With this said, an unholy alliance had been brokered between Suebian traitors alike, who would do everything in their power to prevent Marcellus from approaching the city of Lugdunum.